Broadcasting from the business capital of the world, this is the Podcast Business News Network.
A lot of times we're thinking about the past, and a lot of times there's a lot of negativity there, and with that comes possibly depression. And then you look to the future, which hasn't even gotten here. A lot of people invariably have anxiety because they're anticipating something that hasn't gotten here yet. It's always great to live here in the present. We're going to focus on the past and how it can impact your life in a good way. And I'm present with him, and he's fantastic. He helps people, coaches them, entrepreneurs, business people, regular people, move their lives forward. And he's back with us from coachingforrelevance.com. It is Mr. Randy Swaim on the program. Randy, welcome back. How are you?
Hey, thanks, man. Great to be here with you as always. Thanks, Steve.
And this whole thing starts with a very impactful quote that you recently heard or reheard, and it kind of says a lot, right?
Yeah, it does. It's shared. It actually comes from a lady who is like me. She's a veteran. Actually, she and her husband are both veterans. She's was a F-15 pilot in the Air Force, and she actually was a Thunderbird pilot. She actually flew for the Thunderbirds in their performances for part of her career. She retired as a colonel, and she now does some guest speaking out there and things like that. So, but I'll tell you what, she and I are aligned in kind of what we bring and what we think in many ways, kind of thing. But the quote that she had in it, and it was very valuable. I actually reposted, but I gave her credit for the quote, and she actually messaged me and said, "Thank you for the shout out." And I said, "Hey, my pleasure," kind of thing. But her name is Nicole Milikowski, and the quote is simply this, and it's a short quote, but it's very definitive, and it has so many application aspects to leadership and to leading your teams and things like that. But it's this, it was very simply, your past does not always predict your future, unquote. And it's a key point that people got to think about. And I know we've talked about a couple of times about when you're having to coach your people and lead your people when they're going through struggles or whatever. You know what? Some of their struggles might be mental challenges from 10 years ago, kind of thing. I know my journey has been one of overcoming, and I've kind of shared that a couple of times as we've gone forward and all. But it's like, how do you lead your team? Because if all you do is become the dictatorial person where you point your fingers at them and you say, "This is your job now, you just better do this," and all that, you're not getting the job done. But you know what? When people start to really believe that the struggles they've had in the past does not have to define their future, sometimes miraculous things can happen. And that has a whole spectrum of applications in the leadership role when you're leading your team at work.
There are some, and I love the quote, and there's so much depth in it, but aren't there some times where your past can program your future? And where I'm going with this is, it's been proven. Many therapists, psychiatrists say that things that you went through during your childhood up to age 7, typically, and it could have been a comment you heard that you internalized, or it could have been, maybe one of your parents saying, you can do better than that. Come on, little Johnny. I know you can do better than that. And you may have carried that with you right through your adult life. And then you feel that you're never good enough, or situations like that. So, and it doesn't mean that it's going to fuel your future, because you can rise past that with different, working on yourself and all of that. But how do you address that in relation to the quote?
Well, let me ask you this. As an executive coach, if I was dealing with somebody who was a client that was coming out, can you get a thought of what questions I might ask him right then?
I'm trying to think of what those questions might be.
And again, you don't have to come up with it, but I just throw it out as something for the listeners too, to give some thought to. If you were dealing with somebody, what kind of questions would you ask them? And here's the thing: if you're leading your team back at work and somebody is struggling with something like that in your team, instead of just pointing fingers and threatening them and saying, "This is your job now, you better do that," instead of doing that, what kind of questions are you going to ask to encourage them to think about it and start to believe that they can overcome. And some of the questions, again, it sort of depends on the person that I'm working with, because you always sort of tailor the questions as where they are and kind of who they are and all that. But one of the questions I would ask them is, so how is that holding you back now? And when they start talking a little bit about it, I say, okay, to what extent is all that true?
That's
And
a really good point. That's a really
and
good point.
yeah, and then I might say, well, given that, if you don't want that to be holding you back going forward, what's the one or two things in your experience, in your perception, where you are? What are the one or two things that you need to look at to overcome and leave that behind and go beyond? And guess what? When you're leading a team member, it's one thing to point your fingers at, threaten them, and this is your job now, you better do that. That's what narcissistic dictatorial managers out there do sometimes, not all times, but sometimes. And but if you do that, guess what? You're aggravating the problem, because you're taking what they were struggling with and bringing it to here and reinstituting it, as opposed to saying, what's it going to take for you to get through that? Let's talk about that for a second, because you know what? I think you can. What? Yeah, I think you can. And get them to truly believe in your belief in them, that they can overcome that, and that doesn't have to hold them back. And let's face it, all of us in our journey at some point had something that we had to do to overcome something in our past. We've all had to do that. That's part of development. But sometimes it's a lot bigger than other times. With some people, they may have had to deal with really struggling things.
What if you don't know? What if you don't know what those things are? Maybe you just find yourself repeating the same behavior at work, or let's say you're a manager and you treat people a certain way. And it is something from your past, but you haven't identified it.
Yeah.
Where do you go with that?
And one of the things that you got to do is starting to get them thinking about, in this situation right here, okay, this is where you and your boss want to go. What's holding you back from that? What is it that's making that challenging? What's the one or two things that you think are going to keep you from succeeding in that? And a lot, sometimes if you have somebody that strictly goes into blame gaming everything and everybody else involved, okay, that's blame gaming. I didn't ask you about them. I asked you about you, kind of thing, and get them thinking about it. There are clients that I've asked questions that they didn't know how to answer it right then. And so, what I did is I said, I'll tell you what, this week, think about that. When we meet next week, bring an answer to it. And you know what? Because some people, depending on what it is they're struggling with, or as you just said, correctly so, there are times when they're being held back, but they don't even know what it really is that is, kind of thing. They don't really have that clarity. And so there are some people that they got to think through that for a little bit. And you know what? All of a sudden they may go, "What? Yeah," kind of thing. And I can think of one client that I had, and this client was probably about 10 years ago, but I asked him a question and he said, "Boy, I don't know. And I said, think about it this week. And when we meet next week, tell me what you came up with." And it was so amazing, because he called me 2 days later on the phone, and he was blown away in a positive way. And he said, "I got the answer." I said, "What?" And he told me what the answer was. I said, "Good." I said, "Awesome, buddy. You're amazing. Let's chat about that next week, and we'll do that. That'll be cool." Because he was able to think about it and process that for about 2 days and come up with what that was looking like. And he got a picture of it. And then we could, coach and talk about, okay, so what is it? How are you going to be aware when that's kind of holding you back sometimes? What are the little symptoms that you're going to see and experience in your life that tells you, you know what, that's holding me back right now? And then what are you going to do? And so those are kind of aspects about that, because this aspect about our past does not have to dictate our future, for sure. And we can do better.
When you work with somebody, Randy, do you sometimes ask about their past? That maybe their upbringing. So, tell me about your childhood. How was that?
Yeah.
Do you look a little deeper in there?
I will tell you this, that I typically don't start there, but based on what they are bringing, will it sometimes take you back to talk about that? Yeah.
Okay.
And because sometimes if you find somebody struggling with, and quite frankly, sometimes you'll be working with somebody, and when you're starting to uncover kind of what they really need to fix and change going forward, there was one client, and I think I shared this with you a long time ago. But when I was asking him what his sort of why it matters was, what's that central thing? He was an attorney, a defense attorney, and he said, well, and he said to win. Well, attorneys, a lot of people superficially would say win. But as I looked at him, his whole body language didn't support that. I mean, it was like very lax and, well, to win, this kind of thing. So you know what I did? All I did is I kept him talking. That's all I did. And he talked about a situation when he was in the military, and every bit of his demeanor changed. I mean, the tone in his voice, the look in his eyes, the position of his shoulders on the desk as we were talking and all this. I said, let me ask you something. He said, what's that? I said, let me just share with you something I just noticed. And I told him about the change of the nonverbal communication. And he didn't even aware he was doing that. And I said, what caused that? And what he truly realized is that his true why it matters, if you want to call it that, his true why for his life was to be right. And not to win, but to be right. Even if he lost, to be right. To win when you can, but to be right throughout. And it made a dramatic difference in what he realized. And so a lot of times when you're leading your team, guess what? If you have somebody that there's some evidence in a struggle there, and a lot of times you'll get people on your team that are just control freaks, and all they'll do is sit there and go, yeah, but you know what? They just, he just got to do this, and that kind of thing. And the body language tells you, communicate something if you're aware of it. And but you know what, when you really connect with somebody, so I don't take them back there to begin with. If they bring out some things they're sort of struggling with, and I kind of have them talking about what that is oriented in, a lot of times they'll go back to something in their past. But those are key aspects about it. And if you think about it, this also applies to when you're talking about strategic planning for your team. Because guess what? If this is your strategic plan, just because you did that 10 years ago doesn't mean it's going to work today. If it failed 10 years ago, doesn't mean it's going to fail today. The factors may have changed just enough to make it work. Are you and your team aware of that? Do you have clarity on that so that you can make those action steps in such a way that fits wonderfully in this group of factors that's on scene today? And so this whole thing, when you're talking about that, it's a great quote. And like I said, there's aspects about it that talk about leading your team, but also in strategizing for what your team's trying to accomplish. Do you know what your vision is? Our vision is to be successful. Okay, well, what does that mean?
What is successful? That's
right
too.
That's right. That's right. And getting clarity on it, and also what's going to stand in the way of doing that. And it's like, wow. Yeah, it's amazing. And it's interesting because there was one client over in North Dallas that I was working with. I think this was probably about 8 years ago, but he brought some faith into it. I don't bring faith unless the client does, because it's not about me telling them stuff. It's about me coaching them. And he brought in faith and in some challenging situations in his life journey right there. And it wasn't like anything catastrophic, but there were things getting in the way of him really doing and accomplishing what he wanted. And he said, well, scripture says to be in peace at all things. And I said, yeah. And what he was doing is he was just relaxing in the midst of not getting there. And I said, it does say that. And I said, but you know what else it says? He said, what? And I said, it also says later that Paul talked about he was straining for the prize. He was straining for the prize. And he looked at me with a look of amazement in his eyes. And he said, yeah, you're right. It does say that. I said, so let me ask you something. How did those two line up in your situation right now with what you're trying to do? And he said, boy, I got to give some thought to that. And I said, that's your homework for this week.
Wow.
Bring back an answer to that next week. And so when you talk about what somebody's trying to accomplish, when you talk about the strategic planning that you've got to bring to your team, when you think about when you're working with somebody in your team that's struggling with something, you'd be surprised at how many times when I was talking to somebody and they weren't actually coaching clients. I was kind of I'm also certified as a certified life coach supervisor. So I coach and mentor up and coming coaches and stuff. And I was talking to a guy, and he was kind of almost embarrassed by something that he had struggled with in his life. And I looked at him and I said, I know what you mean. He said, really? I said, yeah, because I struggled with that years ago myself. And he went, what, really? I went, yeah, but I overcame it. And that really, I think, clicked him into positively realizing I can go through this. I can get beyond this. And so that aspect, all of that is wrapped up in this whole concept when you're talking about leading your team, and particularly, let's face it, in a rapidly changing, unpredictable environment where the factors you're confronted with kind of vary. When you have new people come into work for you, each one of those people are a little bit different. Guess what? They're going to have different applications, different visions, different experiences in going to going to a goal. And each one of them has had things in their background. But it's really key when you think of that quote in such a way that it opens up an amazing understanding on their part. And they sit there and they go, you know what? That doesn't have to. And there was one time in my life, and this was quite a while back, but there was one time in my life where, with a situation that happened in my life, I just said, there was something in me that was saying, just go back to that other stuff, because you know what, this ain't going to work and all this kind of stuff. And on the spot, I said, I ain't doing that. I verbalized that. I was the only one there. Nobody else was there to hear it. But I said, I'm not doing that. And I'm amazed at how my life has changed as I went beyond that. And as I, had a completely different mindset going forward, and how successful that has been in many ways. And so it's just, we all deal with those kind of things, but it's a amazing picture and image when you really come to realization of what Nicole said, very correctly so, that you know what, your past doesn't always predict your future. And you know what, that is true.
You bring back images too for me of I worked with somebody for a period of time 14 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Launched a worldwide website. This person was a celebrity.
Yeah.
And it was a whole different concept.
Yeah.
And the concept included people like you, contributors, doing what we're basically doing now.
Mm-hmm.
But there was no Zoom back then.
Mm-hmm.
It was just Skype. The whole concept was fantastic, but I believe it was ahead of its time. And
Mm-hmm.
it had some success, but it wasn't where it needed to be. It was a subscription model as well, where you needed to subscribe to this website and get a lot of inside information. All of that was good. But it was ahead of its time. And I believe that if it happened again, or even like 5 years ago, it would be totally different, because I don't think the world was ready for it.
Yeah. And all of that is key. And it's a good picture of this. And I know we're getting close to the time on the show and everything. But I will say I want to add one other quick thing here with that quote of your past does not always predict your future. But here's the thing that I throw out to people just to think as you go forward, and we can chat about it for a minute if you want to. But it's this: what if your past, the things that you considered were struggles and things that you had to kind of get through that could, in a negative way in your mind, define your future? What if that past was what prepared you actually for an amazing future?
Mm-hmm.
You know, and it's like, even without predicting it, and you look forward and you go, my future. I mean, I've told several people this when I looked at, even when I started my coaching for relevance company about, holy cow, about 14 years ago now. I look at it and I go, never in a while, doing what we're doing here right today, plus what I'm doing working with the neuroplasticians and ION over in Europe, and with the documentaries coming out, my autobiography is coming out. I'm looking at that and I'm going, when I started my company, I had this vision that I was going to be doing nothing but sitting there just coaching one or two people every week, kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And when I look at this and I go, I would have never envisioned this. I would have never even, I mean, just the fact that I've been on PBNN as long as I have, it amazes me that this has happened in a positive way.
Yeah.
And so I offer to people, rather than your past predicting your future, what if your past is what prepared you and developed you and made you overcome a few little things? It made you kind of adapt sort of how you were becoming, so that your future is more amazing than you would have ever imagined. So there's just a lot of stories like that.
Amen. It's just that we could end it right there. That really is it. That is it. And when you get out of the mode of the victim,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
can't believe it happened to me. Really? Well,
yeah.
If you think of it, if you reframe it, as I've done it, and I've done the victim and I've done all of that. When I look back to it, if that didn't happen, then this wouldn't have happened. If that back then in the past didn't happen, then this over here, when it moved into the future, that probably wouldn't have happened. And all of that,
and I wouldn't have been different enough to be able to be good in this future.
Right.
And so what you're saying is right. It's not that the past is creating that, but what it is, it's preparing you initially so that when amazing things happen down the road, you're truly ready for them. And
you need to connect the dots.
Yeah.
And here's another, here you go. The example I gave before of this website.
Yeah.
It was fantastic. All of the stuff that I learned there,
mm-hmm.
I use now.
Yeah.
And I never thought there would be a connection between the two until what I'm doing now with you and others in this realm. Yeah. It was all connected to that. So I think the universe does have a plan. If you get on your surfboard and ride the wave of life.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes you're going to fall off the surfboard, got to get back on it again. The waves are going to come back again.
Yeah.
It's getting you closer to the goal or the shore, however you want to view it.
Yep. And that's not part of the purpose, because if you look at it wrong, or there's a lot of ways you can screw it up in terms of if it does knock you off the surfboard a couple of times or whatever, you can make excuses. You can cast blame games. You can, do whatever. Sure. And yet if you sit there and say, okay, here's what happened. It's nobody else's fault. Nobody, it just happened as it did. Going forward, what do I need to think differently about? And what do I need to do next time if I see those factors starting to come together? And how do I need to act differently? And it's that sort of process through your journey that gets you there. So yeah, it's a great quote that Nicole had. There's a lot of reasons she has my compliments, just as fellow veterans. We've never met, kind of thing. But as fellow veterans and fellow, fighter aviators and
sure.
and also currently in our own roles of, leadership and wanting to develop others and everything. She has my compliments, but there's a lot wrapped up in that one quote, but it's so valuable. And like I said, that quote can energize almost every aspect of what you're doing in leading your team at work to reach goals and to reach that. And to be able to ask the right questions when you have a sense that your people are really trying to overcome that which would have held them back. And
I also believe
huge.
Your key word there in this quote is always, because your past can predict your future. Let's say there was something negative in your future.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Of course, you don't want to repeat that.
Yeah.
But if you allow it, your past will predict your future.
Mm-hmm.
You need to be mindful of it, or
Yeah.
work with somebody that can show you, put a different camera angle on it.
Yeah.
Because it can, if you allow those things to happen, but it doesn't always mean it's going to if you take the right steps.
And that is key, because I was going to ask you sort of answered the question right there, but I was going to ask you this. You're right. It doesn't always, but it can. But under what standard will it be able to predict your future? And the real question is, and you kind of implied this with what you said, correctly so, the real thing that will let it do that is if you allow it to.
Yeah. Yeah. And that goes for good things in your past.
It does.
Or the bad things.
It does. It totally does.
You have the choice.
Yeah. And so how active are we in really moving forward in our journey, in our legacy, and what we want to accomplish in our vision for our life? What point? And I tell you, this whole aspect has been a big part, really, if you look back on it, in my entire journey of life. And I mean, both professionally and personally. And it's just been huge. I mean, my life has been so successful, way more successful than I would have ever even imagined. But you know what? When I look at where I came from and where I had to overcome, it made amazing differences. And what I was developed as a person, as a leader, as a professional in that, and how that was being lived through me is huge. And but the fact is, I never looked back on it and said, that's who I'm going to be. No, never. And so it is huge, but it's a great idea. Again, just a great quote from Nicole Malachowski. And like I said, retired veteran, just like me. She retired as a colonel in the Air Force, a Thunderbird pilot with the Air Force. But a great quote that your past doesn't always have to predict your future.
I will say this. I will say this. My past is usually I run overtime, and my future is they cut us off.
You know what? And there's some positive to that.
Well, yeah, we did take it all the way to the end because this is good stuff today.
Yeah.
Your website is coachingforrelevance.com. You're available to even just get on a quick discovery call to see if it's a right fit, if somebody's looking to make that change, whether they be a leader or just anybody that's maybe looking at their past and thinking it's going to be their future. Might not be that way. Right.
Yeah, exactly. And the people, and you know this because I've said it before, but anybody that calls me that, they can go to my website and see my cell phone number to give me a call and leave a voicemail or whatever, send me an email, whatever. But as you know, and as anybody that's hearing me has heard before, I don't do sales pitches. When I started my first company of Coaching for Relevance here, when I started the company, I said, if I have to go out and do sales calls on cold calls every day, I'm not going to let this be successful. That's not what I'm about. My thing is to connect with people. Now, if somebody that I'm chatting with has this need that they want, we'll come up with a way to get them there, and we'll come up with a price and all that kind of stuff. But a lot of times it's just having a conversation with somebody, and that's what it's about. So that's my goal. So
yeah, and it's also showing things that we don't see because you're seeing it. Randy, great having you on today.
I'll tell you what, always, Steve, and I appreciate it. It's always a pleasure.
Same, and have a great weekend. We'll catch up soon. Okay.
Broadcasting from the business capital of the world, this is the Podcast Business News Network.